Hashtag the daily routine. The morning sun peeked through Harold Thompson's bedroom window, just like it had done for the past 40 years. At exactly 6:30 a.m., the old alarm clock rang with its familiar buzz. Harold, a 93-year-old World War II veteran, slowly opened his eyes and carefully sat up in his bed. His joints weren't as flexible as they used to be, but his spirit remained strong. His bedroom walls told stories of a life well lived. Black and white photographs hung in simple wooden frames, showing a younger Harold in his military uniform, standing proud and tall. Next to these was his favorite picture, one of him and his late wife, Martha, on their wedding day in 1950. She had passed away 20 years ago, but Harold still said good morning to her picture every day. The old veteran had a strict morning routine that he followed without fail. First, he would make his bed with military precision, smoothing out every wrinkle in the sheets. His occupational therapist had suggested he could skip this task to save energy, but Harold wouldn't hear of it. A well-made bed means a well-started day, he would say with a gentle smile. In the bathroom, Harold took his time getting ready. His hands shook slightly as he shaved, but years of practice had taught him to work slowly and carefully. He put on his best casual clothes, a clean white shirt, brown trousers, and his comfortable walking shoes. The final touch was always his Korean War veteran cap, which he wore with quiet pride. Living alone in his modest suburban home wasn't always easy, but Harold had developed clever ways to maintain his independence. He had installed handrails in strategic locations, kept a small notebook to write down important things, and arranged his furniture to create clear walking paths. His neighbors often offered to help, but Harold preferred to manage on his own when he could. The highlight of Harold's day was his morning walk to Pete's Diner, 3 blocks away. He had been going there every morning since Martha passed away, and it had become more than just a place to eat. It was his connection to the world outside his home. He would grab his wooden walking cane, check his wallet was in his pocket, and begin his slow but determined journey. The walk to Pete's was an adventure in itself. Harold knew every crack in the sidewalk, every neighbor's garden, and every street crossing. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived 2 houses down, would often be watering her roses and wave to him. The Chen family's children would sometimes run up to him, asking to hear stories about the old days. Harold always had a piece of candy in his pocket for them, just like he used to carry for his own grandchildren. The morning air felt fresh and clean in his lungs as he walked. Sometimes his back would ache, and his legs would feel tired, but Harold never complained. He had survived worse conditions in the war, and this daily walk was his way of proving to himself that he was still going strong. He would occasionally stop to rest on the bench outside the local bookstore, watching the town come to life around him. At Pete's Diner, everyone knew Harold. The bell above the door would ring as he pushed it open, and Sally, the waitress who had been working there for 15 years, would call out, "Morning, Mr. Thompson." The usual? The usual was 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast, a small bowl of oatmeal, and black coffee. Harold sat at the same corner booth every day, the one with a good view of both the street and the kitchen. The other regular customers at Pete's had become like family to Harold. There was Tom, the mailman who always had a new joke to share, Maria, the high school teacher who would discuss history with him, and old Joe, another veteran who served in Vietnam. They respected Harold's quiet dignity and appreciated his kind words and occasional stories about the old days. As Harold settled into his booth that morning, he felt grateful for these simple pleasures. The warm coffee cup in his hands, the familiar faces around him, and the comfort of his daily routine. He didn't know it yet, but this peaceful morning ritual was about to face an unexpected challenge. Change was coming to Pete's Diner, and Harold's quiet world was about to be turned upside down. Little did he know that this ordinary morning would mark the beginning of an extraordinary chapter in his life, one that would test his patience, courage, and ability to adapt to new circumstances. But for now, Harold Thompson sat peacefully in his corner booth, sipping his coffee and watching the world go by, just as he had done countless mornings before. It started as a normal Tuesday morning at Pete's Diner. Harold was enjoying his usual breakfast when the peaceful atmosphere suddenly changed. The ground seemed to shake with the loud rumble of motorcycle engines. Through the diner's large front window, Harold watched as 10 large motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. The bikers called themselves the Road Warriors. They wore black leather jackets covered in patches and rode expensive new motorcycles that made Harold's ears hurt. Their leader was a tall man with a thick beard who everyone called Big Mike. He had tattoos on his arms and always wore dark sunglasses, even inside the diner. Sally, the waitress, looked worried as the bikers walked in. The bell above the door rang 10 times as they entered one by one, their heavy boots making loud sounds on the tile floor. The quiet morning chatter in the diner stopped. Old Joe, who usually sat near Harold, quickly finished his coffee and left, giving Harold a concerned look on his way out. The road warriors took over the biggest tables in the middle of the diner. They pushed 3 tables together and pulled chairs from other tables, not caring if they scratched the floor. Their loud laughter and rough language filled the small diner. Harold noticed how Mrs. Chen covered her young daughter's ears when one of the bikers told a particularly inappropriate joke. Pete, the diner's owner, tried to keep things normal. He welcomed them politely and took their orders, but Harold could see the worry in his eyes. Pete was a good man who had run the diner for 30 years, and he'd never had to deal with customers like these before. Every morning for the next week, the road warriors came to the diner. They always arrived just after Harold, as if they were timing it on purpose. They would park their motorcycles in a way that took up most of the parking lot, forcing other customers to park far away. Some regular customers stopped coming altogether, afraid of the intimidating group. The bikers seemed to enjoy making fun of Harold, though they never said anything directly to him at first. They would imitate his slow walk when they thought he wasn't looking, or laugh when he had trouble getting up from his booth. One of them started calling him Grandpa Slowpoke, just loud enough for him to hear. Harold tried to ignore them, focusing instead on his breakfast and newspaper, but it was hard to read with all their noise. It was even harder to enjoy his coffee when he could hear them snickering every time his hand shook as he lifted his cup. Some days he thought about finding another place for breakfast, but the idea made him angry. Why should he have to leave? He had been coming to Pete's longer than some of these bikers have been alive. Sally did her best to protect Harold. She would bring his food quickly and check on him more often than usual. Sometimes she would accidentally bump into a biker who was mocking Harold, spilling water or coffee on their jacket, but she couldn't be everywhere at once, and the bikers seemed to enjoy waiting for moments when she was busy in the kitchen. The situation got worse when the bikers discovered that Harold's regular booth gave him a clear view of their tables. They started putting on little shows just for him, pretending to shake like they had palsy when drinking their coffee, or walking with exaggerated slow steps when they passed his table. A few of the older diner regulars tried to stand up for Harold, but the bikers just laughed them off. One morning, Harold overheard Big Mike talking to his group. "Look at him, sitting there like he owns the place," the biker leader said. "These old-timers think they deserve respect just for not dying yet." The words hurt Harold more than he wanted to admit. During the war, he had fought for people's right to live freely, including these bikers who now mocked him. The other customers could see how the situation was affecting Harold. His shoulders started to slump more, and his usual warm smile appeared less often. Even his appetite seemed to decrease. Some mornings he would leave his toast half-eaten, something he had never done before. Pete tried talking to the bikers about their behavior, but they just laughed and ordered more coffee. They knew they were spending more money than the regular customers, and in these tough economic times, Pete couldn't afford to turn away paying customers. The diner had become a battlefield of sorts, but this time, Harold didn't know how to fight back. At least, not yet. The morning started differently than usual. Harold woke up feeling tired after a restless night filled with old war memories. These memories hadn't bothered him for years, but the stress from the diner situation was bringing them back. As he got dressed, he looked at his reflection in the mirror and saw not just an old man, but a soldier who had once stood tall against much worse threats than a group of disrespectful bikers. Despite the heavy feeling in his chest, Harold stuck to his routine. He put on his favorite blue sweater, the one Martha had given him for their last Christmas together, and his Korean War veteran cap. The walk to Pete's diner seemed longer than usual, and he had to stop twice to catch his breath. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed something was wrong and offered him a ride, but Harold politely refused. He needed these walks to keep his independence. When he arrived at the diner, the road warriors were already there, earlier than usual. Harold noticed they had parked their motorcycles even closer to the entrance, leaving barely enough space for people to walk through. As he carefully made his way past their bikes, he heard one of them say, "Watch out, boys. Here comes the slowest show on earth." Inside, Harold found his usual booth occupied by 2 of the younger bikers. They smirked at him as he stood there, pretending not to notice his presence. Sally quickly came over and asked them to move, reminding them that it was Harold's regular spot. "Oh, is his name on it?" One of them sneered, but they eventually moved after Big Mike called them to the main table. Harold settled into his booth, his hands shaking more than usual as he opened his menu, even though he knew it by heart. Sally brought him his coffee without him having to order it, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze of support. The diner was quieter than normal. Many of the regular customers had stopped coming, tired of the bikers' constant disruption. As Harold sipped his coffee, he tried to focus on the newspaper, but the words kept blurring. The bikers were louder than ever, celebrating something with extra rowdy behavior. Their laughter felt like sandpaper on his nerves. He noticed Pate watching from behind the counter, looking worried and helpless in his own diner. Then it happened. One of the larger bikers, a man with a snake tattoo on his neck, got up to get more coffee. As he passed Harold's booth, he deliberately bumped the table hard. Harold's full coffee cup tipped over, sending hot coffee streaming across the table and onto Harold's lap. The hot liquid soaked through his pants, and while it wasn't hot enough to burn badly, the shock and discomfort were real. The biker didn't even pause. Instead, he laughed and said, "Oops, sorry, Gramps. Guess my hand shakes as bad as yours." The other road warriors burst into laughter, some of them pounding their fists on their table. Sally rushed over with a towel, her face red with anger. Even Pete came out from behind the counter, looking like he was finally ready to say something. But Harold raised his hand, stopping them both. With as much dignity as he could muster, he slowly stood up, his pants still dripping with coffee. The diner went quiet. For a long moment, Harold just stood there, looking at the group of bikers. He saw their smirking faces, their mockery barely disguised as humor. But he also saw something else. He saw young men who had never known real hardship, who had never had to fight for something bigger than themselves. Without a word, Harold walked out of the diner. His steps were slow but deliberate. As he passed the bikers' motorcycles, he paused briefly to look at them, remembering something from long ago. Then he continued his walk home, his wet pants uncomfortable in the morning breeze. That evening, Harold sat in his study, surrounded by old photographs and memories. On his desk lay his medals from the war, each one representing a time when he had faced fear and overcome it. On the wall hung a picture of him from 1946, sitting proudly on his old Indian motorcycle. He had been different then, younger, stronger, fearless. As the sun set outside his window, Harold reached a decision. His hands might shake when he held a coffee cup, but they still remembered how to grip motorcycle handlebars. His legs might be slow when he walked, but they hadn't forgotten how to balance a bike. The bikers had awakened something in him, not anger, but determination. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. When someone answered, Harold spoke with a clarity and purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. "Jimmy, it's Harold Thompson. Remember that old Indian motorcycle in my garage? I think it's time we got it running again." The weekend after the coffee incident, Harold stood in front of his garage door. He hadn't opened it fully in 15 years, not since Martha got sick, and he had packed away so many memories. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the old key in the lock. The door creaked loudly as he pulled it up, sending dust dancing in the morning sunlight. The garage was like a museum of his life. Old boxes were stacked everywhere, labeled in Martha's neat handwriting. Christmas decorations, photo albums, and forgotten tools filled the shelves along the walls. But Harold wasn't interested in any of these today. His eyes were fixed on the large shape in the back corner, hidden under an old blue tarp. Getting to it wasn't easy. Harold had to carefully move boxes and squeeze between stacks of old magazines that Martha had never let him throw away. His back protested as he bent to move things, but he kept going. Finally, he reached the tarp-covered shape that had been waiting patiently for him all these years. With shaking hands, Harold grabbed the edge of the tarp. A cloud of dust rose as he pulled it away, making him cough. But when the dust settled, there it was, his 1947 Indian Chief motorcycle. The red paint was faded and covered in dust, and rust had crept across the chrome parts, but Harold could still see the beauty beneath all those years of neglect. Memories flooded back as he ran his weathered hand along the leather seat. He remembered buying it right after coming home from the war, when the world felt full of possibilities. He had saved for months to afford it, working extra shifts at the factory. Martha had thought he was crazy at first, but she grew to love their Sunday rides through the countryside, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist as they cruised down empty roads. Harold circled the motorcycle slowly, examining every part. The tires were completely flat, and mice had made a home in the old saddlebags. The engine would probably need a complete rebuild, but the frame was solid, and all the major parts were still there. It wasn't hopeless, it just needed someone to care about it again. Finding a comfortable spot on an old wooden stool, Harold pulled out his phone and started making calls. First, he called his old friend Jimmy, who had worked as a motorcycle mechanic before retiring. Then he called his grandson Tommy, who was always good with computers. He would need help finding replacement parts online. As he made his calls, Harold felt energy flowing back into his body. Each person he talked to caught some of his excitement. Jimmy promised to come over the next day to look at the engine. Tommy said he would create a list of all the parts they might need. Even Harold's neighbor, Mr. Chen, offered to help clean the garage to make a proper workspace. Looking at the motorcycle reminded Harold of who he used to be, not just a slow-walking old man, but someone who had crossed an ocean to fight for freedom. Someone who had worked hard all his life, someone who had never backed down from a challenge. The road warriors might see him as a frail old-timer, but this motorcycle told a different story. Harold spent the rest of the morning just sitting in the garage making plans. He took out an old notebook and started writing down everything that needed to be done. The list grew long. Clean the fuel tank, check the wiring, rebuild the engine, replace the tires, fix the brakes, restore the chrome, repaint the body. It would take time, money, and lots of hard work. His doctor probably wouldn't approve of him taking on such a big project at his age. His daughter Sarah would definitely worry when she found out. But Harold felt more alive than he had in years. The motorcycle wasn't just a machine that needed fixing. It was a chance to prove something to himself and everyone else. As the afternoon sun filtered through the dusty garage windows, Harold noticed his reflection in an old mirror leaning against the wall. He was smiling, really smiling, for the first time since the bikers had started causing trouble at Pete's. His Korean War veteran cap sat a little straighter on his head, and his shoulders weren't as slumped as they had been lately. Before leaving the garage, Harold patted the old motorcycle's handlebar gently. "We both got some life left in us, don't we, old girl?" he said softly. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. But for now, Harold had something he hadn't had in weeks: hope, and a plan to do something about those troublemaking bikers at Pete's Diner. The next month brought big changes to Harold's life. His garage became a workshop, and his daily routine shifted to focus on the motorcycle restoration. Every morning, he still walked to Pete's Diner, but now he carried a small notebook where he wrote down ideas and made lists of parts he needed. The road warriors were still there, but Harold barely noticed them anymore. His mind was too busy planning his project. Jimmy, his old mechanic friend, became a regular visitor. Despite his own gray hair and arthritis, Jimmy's eyes lit up when he saw the Indian chief. "She's in rough shape," he had said on that first day, "but we can bring her back." Together, they made a workbench from an old door laid across two sawhorses, and Jimmy brought over his old tools that had been collecting dust in his basement. Harold's grandson Tommy turned out to be a blessing. The young man spent hours on his laptop, searching for original Indian motorcycle parts on various websites. He taught Harold how to use the computer to watch restoration videos, and soon Harold was staying up late, studying old motorcycle manuals and learning everything he could about his bike. The physical work was challenging for Harold's old body. His arthritis made it hard to grip tools, and bending over the motorcycle left his back aching. But he refused to give up. He started doing gentle exercises every morning, ones that his doctor had recommended years ago but he had ignored. Slowly, his hands got stronger and his balance improved. Mr. Chen from next door brought over his pressure washer, and together they cleaned years of dirt and grime off the motorcycle. The red paint underneath was faded but still visible. Harold's daughter Sarah visited one weekend and found him covered in grease but smiling. She worried about him working so hard at his age, but seeing his enthusiasm, she instead helped him organize his growing collection of parts and tools. The restoration became a community project. Word spread around the neighborhood about the 93-year-old veteran fixing up his old war-era motorcycle. People started stopping by to help. Mrs. Rodriguez brought lunch for everyone almost daily. The local auto parts store owner gave Harold a discount on supplies. Even the high school shop teacher offered to help repaint the bike when it was ready. Harold had forgotten how good it felt to work with his hands. Each small victory, freeing a rusted bolt, cleaning a carburetor, rewiring a section, gave him more confidence. His hands still shook when he drank coffee, but they were steady when he held a wrench. His walks to the diner became brisker, his posture straighter. The biggest challenge was rebuilding the engine. It took Harold and Jimmy 3 weeks of careful work. They laid out all the parts on a clean white sheet, labeling everything carefully. Harold's fingers remembered things his mind had forgotten: how to adjust the timing, how to set the valves just right. When they finally got it back together, both men had tears in their eyes. One quiet evening, after everyone had gone home, Harold sat on his old stool looking at the progress they'd made. The chrome was starting to shine again, the new tires looked perfect, and the leather seat had been beautifully restored by a local upholsterer who refused to take payment, saying it was an honor to help a veteran. Harold's reflection in the newly polished gas tank showed a different man than the one who had walked into Pete's diner a month ago. His shoulders were squared, his jaw was set with determination, and his eyes had a spark that had been missing for years. The Korean War veteran cap on his head looked proud again, not tired. The transformation wasn't just about the motorcycle. Harold had changed too. His doctor was amazed at his improved strength and flexibility. His neighbors noticed how he walked taller, spoke more confidently. Even his handwriting in the small notebook had become steadier. The road warriors still came to Pete's diner every morning, but their presence didn't bother Harold anymore. He had something they didn't know about, something that was almost ready. As he made his final notes that evening, Harold smiled. Soon, very soon, you would show those young bikers what a real motorcycle enthusiast looked like. Looking at the nearly finished Indian Chief, Harold felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the summer evening. The motorcycle wasn't just transportation. It was a bridge between who he had been and who he was becoming. All those hours of work hadn't just restored an old bike. It had restored his spirit, his confidence, and his pride. The change in the road warrior's attitude started on a hot Tuesday morning. Harold was sitting in his usual booth at Pete's diner, drinking his coffee with a steadier hand than usual, when he overheard two of the bikers talking about vintage motorcycles. They were discussing an old Indian chief they had seen at a motorcycle show, and for the first time, Harold smiled as he listened to their conversation. Without thinking too much about it, Harold cleared his throat and spoke up. The 1947 Indian Chief had a 74 cubic inch V-twin engine, he said, his voice carrying across the diner. Most beautiful sound you'd ever hear when it was running right. The diner went quiet. The two bikers turned to look at Harold, surprise clear on their faces. Big Mike, who was sitting at their usual table, took off his sunglasses and stared at the old veteran. It was the first time Harold had voluntarily spoken to any of them. "You know about Indians?" one of the younger bikers asked, his voice mixed with disbelief and curiosity. Harold nodded, reaching for his wallet. From it, he pulled out an old creased photograph. The picture showed a much younger Harold sitting proudly on a gleaming Indian Chief motorcycle, dressed in his military uniform. The bikers gathered around Harold's booth to look at the photo. Their usual mockery was gone, replaced by genuine interest. This was taken in 1947, Harold explained, his voice growing stronger with each word. Bought her right after I came home from the Pacific. Rode her every day for almost 30 years. Big Mike picked up the photograph carefully, studying it with expert eyes. "This is a real beauty," he said, his gruff voice softer than usual. "Don't see many of these anymore. What happened to it?" Harold smiled, thinking about the nearly restored motorcycle in his garage. "She's still around," he said simply. But the bikers weren't done asking questions. They wanted to know about the motorcycle's specifications, about what it was like to ride in those days, about the modifications Harold had made to it over the years. As Harold talked about his beloved motorcycle, he noticed the road warriors were listening with real respect. They pulled up chairs around his booth, forgetting about their usual rowdy behavior. When Harold mentioned serving in the Pacific during World War II, Big Mike's expression changed completely. "Wait a minute," Big Mike said, leaning forward. "You served in the Pacific? What unit were you with?" When Harold told him, Big Mike's tough guy facade cracked entirely. "My grandfather was in that same unit," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He used to tell me stories about their missions. The conversation shifted from motorcycles to military service. Harold shared stories about his time in the war, about the brotherhood he had found there, about the friends he had lost. The younger bikers listened intently, their earlier disrespect forgotten. Some of them were veterans themselves, from more recent conflicts, and they began sharing their own experiences. Sally, the waitress, watched in amazement as the scene unfolded. The usual morning customers couldn't believe their eyes. The same bikers who had been mocking Harold for weeks were now treating him like a respected elder, hanging on his every word. Throughout the morning, more details about Harold's life emerged. He told them about restoring motorcycles after the war, about teaching young riders how to maintain their bikes, about the cross-country trips he and Martha had taken on the Indian. With each story, the road warriors' respect grew. "Man, we've been such idiots," one of the younger bikers said, looking ashamed. "We had no idea who you were, what you'd done." Others nodded in agreement, looking uncomfortable as they remembered their previous behavior. Big Mike stood up suddenly. "Mr. Thompson," he said formally, "on behalf of the road warriors, I want to apologize for how we've treated you. We dishonored ourselves by disrespecting a veteran and a fellow rider." The other bikers murmured their agreement. The atmosphere in the diner had changed completely. Pete, watching from behind the counter, smiled as he saw his regular customers relaxing for the first time in weeks. Before leaving that morning, Big Mike asked Harold if they could come by sometime to see the Indian, if he still had it. Harold's eyes twinkled as he thought about his almost finished restoration project. "Come by next week," he said. "I might have something to show you boys." As the bikers left the diner that morning, each one nodded respectfully to Harold. The older veteran sat back in his booth, sipping his coffee with a satisfied smile. The photograph lay on the table, the young soldier in the picture seeming to smile knowingly at how things had turned out. The summer morning dawned bright and clear. Harold woke up earlier than usual, his heart beating with excitement. Today was the day he would ride his restored Indian chief to Pete's diner. He had kept its completion a secret from everyone except those who had helped with the restoration. In his bedroom, Harold opened his closet and pulled out something he hadn't worn in decades, his old leather riding jacket. The jacket was still in good condition, thanks to Martha's careful storage. It was a bit tight around the middle now, but when Harold looked in the mirror, he saw glimpses of his younger self. Jimmy arrived early to help Harold with final checks on the motorcycle. They went through everything one last time: brakes, lights, oil levels, tire pressure. The Indian chief gleamed in the early morning sun, its red paint and chrome sparkling like new. The engine had been perfectly tuned, and the leather seat looked beautiful. "She's ready, Harold," Jimmy said with a proud smile. "Show those young fellows what a real classic looks like." Harold put on his new helmet, a compromise he had made with his daughter Sarah. It was a vintage-style helmet that matched the motorcycle's classic look. His Korean War veteran cap fit perfectly underneath. His hands didn't shake at all as he pulled on his riding gloves. Starting the motorcycle brought tears to Harold's eyes. The familiar rumble of the engine took him back 50 years. He sat there for a moment, letting the engine warm up, remembering all the miles he and this motorcycle had traveled together. The ride to Pete's diner was like a parade. Neighbors came out of their houses when they heard the distinctive sound of the Indian chief. Mrs. Rodriguez cheered from her garden. The Chen family took pictures. Even the mail carrier stopped his truck to watch Harold ride past. The road warriors' motorcycles were already parked at Pete's when Harold arrived. You could see them all inside, having their usual morning coffee. With a small smile, Harold guided his Indian chief into the parking lot, the engine's deep rumble catching everyone's attention. The sound brought the bikers to the diner's windows. Their faces showed disbelief as they watched the elderly veteran smoothly park his perfectly restored classic motorcycle right next to their modern bikes. The Indian chief's engine gave a few more confident rumbles before Harold turned it off. Harold took his time getting off the motorcycle, removing his helmet and gloves with practiced movements. You could see people inside the diner taking pictures with their phones. Sally was bouncing with excitement at the window, and Pete had come out from behind his counter to watch. Big Mike was the first one out the door, followed by the rest of the road warriors. They circled the Indian chief, their expressions a mixture of awe and respect. The restoration was perfect, every detail historically accurate, every piece gleaming with care and attention. "Mr. Thompson," Big Mike said, shaking his head in amazement. This is incredible. She's absolutely beautiful. The other bikers murmured in agreement, some kneeling to get a better look at the engine, others admiring the classic lines of the motorcycle. Would you mind starting her up again? One of the younger bikers asked eagerly. Harold smiled and swung his leg over the seat. The Indian Chief roared to life, its engine sound echoing off the diner's walls. Several bikers pulled out their phones to record the moment. What happened next surprised everyone, especially Harold. Big Mike gathered all the road warriors together and had a quick discussion. Then he turned to Harold with a serious expression. Mr. Thompson, he said formally, the road warriors would be honored if you would accept a position as an honorary member of our club. He pulled out a leather vest with the club's patches on it. We had this made special for you. It's got your name and World War II veteran on it. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he took the vest. The other customers in the diner had come outside to watch, and they broke into applause as Big Mike helped Harold put on the vest over his leather jacket. One more thing, Big Mike added with a grin. Would you meet us on a ride? We'd be proud to follow a veteran and a true motorcycle expert. Harold looked at the group of bikers who had once mocked him, but now stood respectfully waiting for his answer. He thought about how far they'd all come, not just in their attitudes, but in understanding and respecting each other. Well, Harold said, his eyes twinkling, I know some nice country roads where this old Indian can really show what she can do. Think you young fellows can keep up? 6 months had passed since Harold first rode his restored Indian Chief to Pete's diner. Life had changed in ways the 93-year-old veteran could never have imagined. The road warriors had become more than just friendly faces at the diner. They had become his family. Every Sunday morning, the rumble of motorcycles would fill Harold's street as the road warriors came to pick him up for their weekly ride. Neighbors no longer hurried inside when they heard the motorcycles approaching. Instead, they would come out to wave and take pictures of Harold leading the group on his classic Indian Chief, his honorary member vests gleaming with patches and pins. Pete's diner had transformed too. The once quiet breakfast spot had become a popular gathering place for motorcycle enthusiasts from all over the state. They came to see the famous 93-year-old veteran and his perfectly restored 1947 Indian Chief. Harold's regular booth now had a small brass plaque on it that read, Reserved for Harold Thompson, World War II veteran, road warrior, legend. Big Mike had taken to arriving early at the diner just to hear Harold's stories. The tough biker leader would sit for hours, listening to tales about motorcycle mechanics from the 1940s and stories from the war. He started bringing his teenage son along, wanting the boy to learn from Harold's experience and wisdom. The road warriors had changed as well. They still wore their leather jackets and rode powerful motorcycles, but their behavior was different. They had learned respect, not just for Harold, but for everyone at the diner. They helped older customers with doors, kept their voices down during busy times, and even started a monthly fundraiser for local veterans. Harold's daughter Sarah had worried at first about him riding at his age, but seeing her father's happiness changed her mind. She would visit more often now, bringing her children to hear Grandpa Harold's stories about motorcycles and his military service. His grandson Tommy had even bought his own motorcycle, taking lessons from Harold and the road warriors on how to ride safely. The local newspaper had written a story about Harold and the bikers, titled Never Too Late for Friendship. The article included a photograph of Harold leading a group of 30 motorcycles through town, his Korean War veteran cap visible under his helmet. The story was picked up by national news, and soon Harold was receiving letters from veterans and motorcycle enthusiasts all over the country. One particularly special day came when Harold and the road warriors organized a veteran appreciation ride. Over 100 motorcycles participated, with Harold in the lead on his Indian Chief. They visited 3 veterans' homes, where Harold spoke to fellow veterans about never giving up and finding friendship in unexpected places. The road warriors presented each facility with a donation they had collected. Even Harold's health had improved. His doctor was amazed at his latest checkup. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it, the doctor had said, noting Harold's better balance, stronger grip, and improved spirits. The regular rides and social interaction had given Harold a new lease on life. Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Chen had become unofficial photographers for the Sunday rides, taking pictures and videos that they shared on social media. Their children had started a fan page for Harold and the Road Warriors, which had thousands of followers who loved seeing updates about the 93-year-old biker and his unlikely friends. The most meaningful change was in Harold himself. The sad, lonely widower who had shuffled to the diner each morning was gone. In his place was a proud veteran who stood tall, shared his stories, and inspired others. His hands no longer shook when he drank his coffee, and his smile came easily and often. One quiet evening, as Harold sat in his garage cleaning his motorcycle, he found himself talking to Martha's picture like he often did. "You wouldn't believe it, dear," he said with a chuckle, "but those troublemakers turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to me." The Indian chief gleamed in the garage light, ready for the next day's adventure. On the wall hung Harold's Road Warrior's vest, covered in patches that told the story of his new life. Honorary member, World War II veteran, original Indian rider, and the newest one, living legend. As Harold prepared for bed that night, he smiled at the thought of tomorrow's breakfast at Pete's Diner. Who would have thought that at 93 he would find a new family, a new purpose, and a new adventure? Life, he had learned, was full of surprises. Sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best changes, and it was never too late to start a new chapter.